Hello and welcome to the course Introduction to the Psychology of Language. I am Dr. Ark Verma from IIT Kanpur and we are in the second week of the course. This week we are talking about development of language in infants and young children. We are actually talking about how is the child acquiring language, how does the child acquire language, what are the basic tasks that the child needs to do in order to pick up language from hearing to the fact of producing flawless speech. So these are some of the things that we are going to talk about. In the last lecture, you saw me discussing some of the driving forces which could drive language development. Say for example, how is this happening? Is it through imitation or learning, or is it happening through child directed speech? We also talked a little bit about some of the early basic tasks that the child needs to do. Okay. In today's lecture, we will talk about some of the first steps in acquisition of language. Okay. What are the first building blocks that kind of establish the foundation for a child learning language? What are the first things that the child needs to do? Let us look at that. Now, the task at hand is fairly complex. Okay. The task at hand for a child to figure out what language is, how language functions, to the point of not only mastering the rules of the language but also being able to produce them effectively is something very difficult. One of the first things that infants would need to do is to figure out which speech sounds their language comprises of. They listen to a lot of things. Children are exposed to lots of noises, lots of sounds, even as you saw starting from the third trimester of their mother's pregnancy. While they are born, even before they are born, the auditory system has started functioning. They are exposed to all kinds of sounds, from animal sounds to human sounds to motor sounds to sounds of traffic and to sounds of machinery. Maybe depending on where all, say for example, the mother has been and whatever has been the input, the child hears everything. One of the first tasks, so to speak, then for the child will be able to distinguish from non-speech sounds. Also, in the speech sound, if you see, for the most part when people are talking amongst themselves, they are talking in a manner which is hardly intelligible with the child. The child does not know what are the basic sounds. We do not really speak in ba, pa, da and da so as to help the child figure out, okay, these are the sounds of my language and this is very easy. And then we do not also talk about like pa and ta, so that the child can easily combine pa and ta to form pat, to form, say for example, one of the first words of the language. Or we do not really talk about ma and pa in a sense that the child can combine these phonemes to create the first words that the child eventually speaks. In that sense, the child also has to kind of from this continuous stream of speech be able to distinguish, isolate particular phonemes, recognize that, okay, these are meaningful sounds in my language, these are the phonemes, and the other sounds like the drr or the grr of the motor is not. This is a fairly difficult task. So one of the first things that the child has to do is to kind of really get to a point that the child has an inventory of the basic sounds of their language. Once the child will have the inventory of this, the child will need to move to the second step. The second step is to be able to combine these phonemes, to be able to combine these sounds into words. Okay. So what are words? The child first has to figure out sounds and then the child also has to figure out words. Okay, if I combine ka and ta in and I have ka here, then this forms cat. Cat is a meaningful word in my language. Mama is a meaningful word in my language. Papa is a meaningful word in my language. The child also has to figure out the rules that are used to combine these things. And the fact, once the child kind of does, okay, this is papa, this is mama, this is cat, this is dada, this is whatever, the child will eventually then need to understand the meaning of each of these constructions. So you see, to a child, these seem to be very difficult tasks. If you really want to get a taste of how this probably happens, you could, and I always say this in class, try listening to a movie which is not dubbed in your own language. You could go and listen to Chinese or Dutch or Polish or German, and you try and just, if you've not been, if you're not taking the aid of subtitles, just try and see how does that really sound. Just try and let us say isolate words from the speech. Just try and say, for example, make out what this particular utterance mean and how does this particular utterance map to something happening in the world. If you try and do it yourself, you will figure out that this is fairly difficult task, and we are talking about children who are just born on the face of this earth and are barely about themselves. So, the child needs to figure out the sounds, the child needs to figure out how the sounds are going to be combined to form words, and then what are the meanings of these words. And once the child has kind of got all three of them together, the hardest task of all comes. The hardest task of all is for the child to start forming sentences. So, the child needs to, even though he now knows, let us say, meanings of each of these words, the child needs to put together these words in a perfect order using a perfect syntactical grammatical rule of their native language to form a grammatically acceptable sentence, because that is one of the measures whether the child has acquired the language completely or not. So, children, by the way, they do this as early, they start doing this very well by the age of 2.5, 3.5 years of age. This is fairly quick if you remember, if you really think of it, and if you really think of the difficulty that each of these tasks have. In the coming lectures of this week, we will talk about each of these challenges, and we will talk about also what the two basic theories, the behavioral stance and the nativist stance, have to say about how children are picking up aspects of this knowledge. Okay. In today's week, we will probably mostly concern ourselves with understanding or figuring out the phonemes of a language. Before that, I will just point that out to you, I will just remind you that all of these tasks the children have to do without any specific or explicit instructions. For the most part, children are doing this with very little environmental feedback, with very little instruction by the way of actually telling them how to do this. Okay. So, children are kind of doing this by themselves gradually as their brains are developing, gradually as they are getting more and more experience of the world, of the language that they are being exposed to. So, coming back, what are we going to talk about in today's lecture? We are going to talk mostly about how the child reaches or kind of reaches a place where he knows or she knows the number of phonemes, the number of basic sounds that exist in the language. Okay. Let us talk about perception and categorization of phonemes. Now, phonemes, I have been saying this word a few times, phonemes are the building blocks of child's language. They are the basic sounds that comprise any of the languages that a child might be exposed to. This is basically all the sounds that are there in Hindi. If you kind of put together that Hindi has all of these sounds, they might be 20, 30, 40, 48, 45, whatever. The child has to know, and the child has to be able to in some sense isolate all these 40, 60 sounds from the continuous speech input that the child is getting exposed to. Okay. So, the child has to do this. Also, the child has to do this in a scenario which makes this very difficult, because different speakers speak differently. Okay. Suppose I were to say pink and you were to say pink and somebody else were to say pink, and if you take our utterances and you analyze it physically, you will see that each of our utterances are physically very different. Okay. In terms of a frequency plot, all of them will sound really very different, the amount of energy and etc. In there will make the signals look very different. Still, the child has to figure out that each of these things are very different signals, the per here and the per there and the per here are very different. So, the child has to kind of really do this. Also, the child has to in some sense be able to not distinguish instances of phonemes that are not very different. Okay. So, this is basically a basic task. Two things that the child needs to do is that the child needs to distinguish between phonemes that are adequately different and not distinguish phonemes which have minor variations. We will come to that in this, and also I will discuss this in the coming lectures. Now, this is not really a simple task, as I was saying, because different speech sounds may have physical similarities, while they may have physical similarities when I say pa and you say pa, but they are not physically actually identical. So, that is one. There are variations in different speakers because different speakers have these different vocal tracts, and the signature of speech might be very different. Something to be heard by a person, they probably sound very different in that sense. This also sometimes lead to speakers having very high pitched voices. Somebody speaks very loudly and somebody speaks very fast. So there are these variations as well, and the child has to kind of grapple through all of these variety of auditory input that the child is getting exposed to, and from that very confused jigsaw really figure out all the 30-40 sounds that the language will have. However, it has been documented that despite all of these differences, adults broadly kind of produce around a fixed number of sounds in the given language. So English has around 40 phonemes, okay. All the English input, all the English speakers included, the sum total of that can be categorized into basically just 40 basic sounds. Okay. Obviously variations of them are also there with respect to speaker in condition and different conditions, but broadly this is all to be condensed into 40 sounds, and this is the 40 sounds that the child has to figure out by the time the child starts picking up first aspects of language. Adult speakers are also very good at two things, as I was saying. They do not easily notice the differences between two sounds of the same category. So different versions of pa, as I say it or you say it or somebody else say it, all of our pas, even though physically will be different signatures, will still sound the same, sort of, okay, will appear to us as pa only, okay. Also they rarely confuse two sounds that belong to different categories. So if I say pa and ba and the other person says pa and ba and you say pa and ba, children should also be able to distinguish pa and ba separately in all the three speakers, okay, and this is because this is what adults are very good at doing. So these are the two skills, as I was saying, children need to really figure out. Now it has been proposed that very young infants respond to speech sounds in a very similar manner as adults. They are very good at doing this as soon as they are born. They don't really take a lot of time in picking this up. Let us see some examples. Using a variant of the HAS procedure, we talked about the HAS procedure in the last lecture as well. Imaz and colleagues 1971 presented 1 and 4-month-old infants with a syllable that had a short onset time like ba, and basically what is a short onset time basically is referred to as voice onset time, and this is typically the time gap between when you start speaking the sound and by the time your vocal cords start vibrating. Okay. So there are sounds like that have short onset time like ba, and there are sounds that have a slightly longer onset time like pa. Okay. So the gap is kind of a little bit more, but the bottom line is that the child was presented with a syllable with a short onset time, mainly ba, and once they were habituated to this, they were presented with two kinds of test symbols. One test symbol has similarly a short voice onset time like ba, and the other test syllable has a slightly long onset time like pa. Now how would adults do this? Adults would perceive the test syllable and the short onset time example as the same category, and they would basically perceive the test syllable and the long onset time probe as a different category. This is what adults would do. How would infants perform on this? Let us check. It was found that when the original and the replacement stimuli both had short voice onset times, the infants treated them as the same category, much as the adults do. In the other case, where the test syllable and the replacement had different voice onset times, the infants were able to correctly classify them as being different. So you see, infants are also perceiving sound or perceiving phonemes in much the same manner that the adults are doing. Now this ability, a very basic and a very fundamental ability of learning language, the ability of being able to regard sounds as discrete categories, is referred to as categorical perception. And categorical perception is one of the most fundamental basic property of children, and we see that this is there with children as young as 1 month old and 4 months old. Okay. So this is something that the children already have mastered by a very young age. Now, such a finding, when you kind of come up with this kind of a result, that humans might perceive speech sounds using specialized mechanisms, because say for example people weren't able to explain how quickly children are learning this. So they said that maybe what is happening is that children are perceiving speech sounds using very specialized mechanisms that are genetically determined. We are born with these mechanisms which obviously are genetically endowed to us, and these are the mechanisms that are helping us perceive speech in so many discrete categories. So that is what basically was proposed. Now all good, but there are also counter evidences to proposals. So similarly, this evidence was also countered with the fact that other species as well, non-human species like the chinchillas and the Japanese quail, are also capable of doing categorical perception, that is regarding speech sounds into discrete categories, categorizing speech sound into discrete categories. So this was kind of very quickly countered. Also it has been shown in a range of studies that children are also very good at categorical perception of non-speech sounds. So they can also do this, say for example with artificially generated speech sounds, sounds that are generated by a computer, and if they are sufficiently different from each other, the child will be able to notice and respond to the difference. Now if the child is able to do this for speech sounds as well as non-speech sounds, and remember there is no evolutionary advantage to categorically perceiving non-speech sounds, then where are we? Okay, how do we explain that? So one of the ways could be to say that children have two basic speech mechanisms, one for speech sounds, one for non-speech sounds, but that is a slightly more complicated way of doing this. However, a much simpler assumption could be that categorical perception of speech probably is using a very generic auditory perception mechanism that is kind of processing all kinds of sounds, and hence it kind of negates the use or possibility of having a genetically determined processing mechanism. Okay, so this is something, but again remember that categorical speech perception is one of the most important and foundational skills that the child needs in order to pick up phonemes and categorize them into discrete categories, because this is building on which the child will later be able to combine these phonemes and form words and so on. Now also there are other points that kind of support the genetic basis of some aspects of speech processing, even though this did not really work, but there is probably some weight in the idea of children being able to or children possessing some genetically determined / innate skills for perceiving speech. Let us look at that. Infants appear to have innate preference for speech sounds. They prefer listening to human speech as opposed to listening to train sounds or motor sounds or sounds of bells or something like that. Okay, so they have this preference, and this seems to be evolutionarily endowed. So this means that something about speech is special, and children obviously have an innate affinity towards listening to speech. So such findings have kind of led people to propose that infants may be using something similar to what is referred to as the innately guided learning. What is something that they innately possess, and what is this innately guided learning doing? This innately guided learning drives the child to pay attention to specific aspects of the environment, speech sounds, and to notice the tempo in the speech and so many other things, on the basis of which the child will be able to pick up some of these things. Okay, the child will be able to pick up the basic nature of how human language is. This also in that sense will allow for detailed processing of speech sound. You remember that infants already in the 3rd trimester of pregnancy could distinguish between a familiar versus an unfamiliar nursery rhyme. They preferred listening to French over Russian. Where is all this coming from? Probably from this innately guided learning mechanism. Also, this innately guided learning mechanism kind of leads to learning when children are exposed to specific languages. They begin with little knowledge to gradually mastering the phonological, lexical, morphological and syntactic knowledge of their native knowledge of their native language. This seems to be a very generic mechanism. It probably starts with the basic idea of whatever language is exposed to I will pick up, and then depending on the statistically large amount of input of whatever language they listen to, they kind of gradually use this to pick up both the phonology, the words and morphology and the syntax of that knowledge. So, this is something which is there in the proposal. Now, in order to test for this account, what can we do? We can probably check if young infants do have broad speech categories, and that those broad speech categories should gradually get refined as the infants get exposed to more and more input in their specific language, okay, in the native language that they have to learn. So, putting this differently, it is possible that the child could be able to recognize specific phonological contrasts. What are the phonological contrasts? The phonological contrasts are differences between phonemes of a particular language. Okay. Japanese, some children are not being able to distinguish between r and l because these are liquid phoneme, and Japanese language does not distinguish between them so much. Let us take another example. So, Kikuyu, in Kikuyu language, there is no distinction between ba and pa, whereas in English, ba and pa are two discrete sounds, and everybody who speaks or learns to speak English can and should be able to distinguish between ba and pa. Okay. But if you test Kikuyu children, you would probably believe that they shouldn't be able to distinguish because this is not in their language. And in any environment that are being raised, they are not being exposed to the distinction between ba and pa. So, typically they should not be able to do it. However, when 2-month-old Kikuyu infants were tested on stimuli that were English equivalents of ba and pa, they could tell the difference. Okay. Similarly, when 7-month-old English speaking infants were tested on Hindi aspirated and non-aspirated contrasts like pa and pa, for example, they could also perceive the difference. Now, why is this happening? Why is this useful? If you really wonder, this could be possible because the mechanism when the child is born or the children are born is a very generic mechanism, okay, and the mechanism has to be ready to encounter and learn any language that comes the child's way. So, the mechanism at birth is very, very generic. You expose it to Kikuyu, English, Hindi, Chinese, Japanese, German, the mechanism should be able to pick up the phonological contrasts or phonological differences from any of these languages, okay, in order to be prepared for learning any of the language that there is. However, with time, when the child latches on to one of these languages as the native language, suppose the child is born in a Kikuyu tribe or English speaking family or a Hindi speaking family, the child will start mastering the phonological contrast of their specific language and will gradually start losing out on the phonological contrast of the non-native language. Let us see if that really happens. So, these findings suggest that children are probably born with a categorical organization of phonology that allows them to detect contrasts that may or may not be important in their language. This may also help them appreciate any kinds of contrasts present in adult language, because they have to figure out, and they have to basically figure out which are the important and meaningful contrasts and which are not. As I said, this will keep them prepared to learn any of the languages that are there. Okay. Now, once they have figured out the important phonological contrast, so this ba and pa is important for my language, but if I am a Kikuyu speaker, ba and pa is not important for my language. So, after I am 6 or 8 months old or 1 year old, I should probably forget it. I should not probably be remembering this. So, does that really happen? Let us test. Okay. Before moving on, additionally also what the children have to do is they have to learn which of the phonological contrasts are important for learning their native language, and to arrange the phonological categories in such a manner that the variations of the same phoneme are clubbed together, while phonemes that are sufficiently different are stored discretely. Building on this, they have to also acquire this skill. Now, what are we talking about? Whether children forget the non-native contrasts of a different language. Let us see. Experiments have shown that children's organization of phonemes does actually change drastically after 1 year of age. For example, infants' ability to perceive non-native phonological contrasts is greatly diminished by the time they are 1 year of age. We saw that by the age of 2 months and 6 to 7 months, they were being able to perceive non-native contrasts fairly nicely. However, by the time they are 1 year of age and above, they are not able to perceive the non-native phonological contrasts. Okay. Also, their response to phonological contrasts also changes. The way they respond to phonological contrasts also kind of changes in measurable ways. Now, researchers have suggested that one of the new changes that, that happens with the child that is growing up from 6-7 months age, 6-7 months of age to 1-1.5 years of age, is the emergence of what is referred to as phonological prototypes. What are phonological prototypes? Now, a phonological prototype is typically it's a perceptual average of specific instances of a given phoneme. It's not as complicated as it sounds. It's simply when I say pa and the other speaker says pa and the other speaker says pa. So if 10 of the speakers are saying pa, and we are all probably saying this in our own idiosyncratic manner. You know, you can look at this very nicely when you're talking, when you're listening to different people speaking their non-native language. Say for example, if a French guy is speaking English versus a you know UP guy is speaking English versus a Punjabi guy is speaking English, or a Tamil guy is speaking English, or this you know Mexicans and Italians speak English. All of them, if they are speaking their non-native language, you can distinguish very well that their own all of their utterances of pa and ba and some of the basic sounds will probably be slightly different. Now, how does the child really figure that out? So, what the child does is it stores a perceptual average of all of the pa's that are entered, creates a sort of a perceptual magnet, and then stores minor variations from this magnet as in the same category. If the variations are more than a particular threshold, then the child would categorize this as a separate sound altogether. So, pa, all of that will probably be in the same, but as soon as pa goes to ba, there is a new category that is born. So, it kind of distinguishes between these two categories very well. Okay. So, infants are exposed to a variety of versions of a given phoneme, as I was saying, and as different speakers provide different inputs of the same phoneme, and by mapping together these different instances of the phonemes based on their physical similarities, and by treating the average as a perceptual magnet, this is very interesting the way Traxler puts it, the infant learns to de-emphasize minor variations and super-emphasize major differences. Okay. So, smaller variations are kind of clubbed together, this is all pa, and larger variations are kind of discretized in a sense that pa, this is pa and this is pa, and they are not the same thing. Because see, why I say this is a meaningful contrast and non-meaningful contrast, if you say pat versus if you say bat, there are two different things altogether, and even though physically the two sounds are very similar. So, this is something that the child has to pick up, this is something that the child has to master. So, phonological prototypes, because they exist in this way, they lead to the child having sharper distinctions between phoneme categories that are used contrastively, and phoneme distinctions that are not meaningful then eventually drop out of the system of the phonological representations. So, as in when you are learning in your native language, say for example Hindi increases, your learning of some of the other languages kind of temporarily probably needs to fade out. Okay, because you are latching on to the phonological representations of this language and kind of internalizing them in a broad sense, so to speak. This is probably also one of the reasons, as we might talk later, is that whenever you are learning a second or a third language, the phonological manifestation of the first language kind of still sticks around. Tamil guy, or if a Malayalam guy speaks English, you can still detect overtones of Malayalam phonology or Tamil phonology or Hindi phonology in Hindi speakers, so to speak, to be very clearly there. This is something which we kind of call accent or something like that, that these things are there. Okay. And so, how can we test this? So, to test this, what they did was they kind of tested 6-month-old English and Swedish infants, and these English and Swedish infants were exposed to minor variations from each of the English and Swedish prototypes, and they were asked to respond to these prototypes, and it was found that they responded to these prototypes in different ways. How is that? So, when while Swedish infants treated minor variations of the Swedish prototype as being the same phoneme, but treated equally minor variations of the English prototype as being completely different phonemes. Similarly, the English speaking infants treated minor variations of the English prototype as the same category, but minor variations of the Swedish prototype as very different categories. So, this is where we see that children are kind of using the knowledge of prototypes, which by the way started from them being able to do the categorical perception in a very incremental manner and learning the sounds or learning the phonological representations of their language. Okay. So, this was probably the first challenge that the children need to do in order to learn language, that is mastering the phonemes of the language. Okay, we've had 2 lectures in this series. Coming lectures we'll move further with talking about how does the child move further in acquiring language. Thank you.